Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Cup Duet Reviews. My name is Jillian Robinson. I am the Associate Artistic Producer here at Cup of Hemlock Theatre, and today I'm joined by the wonderful Ryan Borochovitz, one of our co-artistic producers. Ryan, how are you feeling today?
I'm feeling okay, Jill. How are you?
I'm feeling okay as well. Thanks so much for asking. Today, Ryan and I have the great honor of discussing a wonderful show that we got to see last night. It is Mukashi Once Upon a Time. So, this production is a co production, a Japanese and Canadian co production with Osaka's Kio's Company and Toronto's Corpus Company. These companies actually have been intertwined since 2010. And actually, 4 years ago, they decided to join forces and create this new work, Mukashi Once Upon a Time. And what a great privilege it was to sit and laugh and bear witness to the wonderful vignettes. Again, we'll get into how the structure and story of this contemporary fairy tale sort of unfurl before our eyes, a very East meets West sort of take. Before we get too far in, again, this production, it had a little bit of a short run in Toronto at the Theatre Centre from September 25 to the 29th, but hopefully it'll get picked up and continue gracing our stages all around the world. But before we get too far in, let's do our classic icebreaker here at the Cup. Ryan, what are you sipping on today?
Kind of boring today. I just have a glass of water. Hope that's all right.
That's
how,
okay. You know what?
how
I'll
about you?
jump on the boring train and cheers you with my glass of water.
Cheers. Stay hydrated.
Um, there was a wonderful trickling water sound effect in
True.
this show, so I think it is on brand in some shape or
Yes,
form.
we clearly thought this through. It's on theme.
Staying hydrated. I actually didn't realize that I am a little bit on theme costume. What I'm wearing wardrobe wise, white. There is crane stories throughout, and obviously crane and wolf are. We'll get into it. Main sort of symbols of this piece. So I am wearing. I just decided to wear white to the theater, and I was like, oh, look at that. So that's what my ensemble is, I guess, for today.
Nice.
So I kind of mentioned a little bit in my intro to the piece the wonderful program that both companies have mapped out for us. I know we do this, those of you watching on YouTube, we sometimes bring the program up on screen. Such a lovely program. Thank you so much for taking the time to create. There is a lot of resources and wonderful sort of information about the different genres of theater that are sprinkled throughout the piece in this program. So if you get your hands on this program, it's lovely. There's also a QR for a virtual one too. But at the very top, it says East meets West in a contemporary fairy tale. And that sort of, to me, is a little umbrella to take us into our usual synopsis of what we saw. Ryan, do you want to map out a little bit more
Yeah.
in depth
Yeah,
for
sure. I'll do
us?
my best with this
Mukashi.
piece. I will say, even though we are getting this episode out after the too short run has already ended, we will still do a pre spoiler, post spoiler section here, just because we do hope that this piece will continue to tour and that others might see this episode in anticipation of seeing it at a later stage of its development or its tour. So, the kind of parenthetical once upon a time that sometimes accompanies that title, would suggest is that this is a phrase that I was not familiar with, but as I understood it, and please feel free if you interpreted things differently to correct me at any point, but I understood that as, if not a direct translation of Once Upon a Time, it is at least the kind of iterative, repeatable beginning to a fairy tale story sequence that would be the case if you are hearing fairy tales in Japan, as opposed to the more Anglophile Western Once Upon a Time that you and I were probably most familiar with when we were told fairy tales as children. And so merging these two narrative entrance points, the Mukashi and Once Upon a Time, is a testament to that East meets West, insofar as this is a piece that's kind of dance, kind of cabaret, kind of sketch comedy in a bit of a way, a bit of a sort of hodgepodge melange of various different styles and ideas. It draws very heavily from different forms of Japanese traditional performances. The ultimate thrust of it is that it takes two stock characters from fairy tales, one Western and one Japanese, and does a series of riffs on popular fairy tales involving them, specifically the Western archetype of the wolf, most commonly seen as this piece engages in the Little Red Riding Hood fairy tale, even though the wolf shows up in all kinds of different Western and European folktales. And then the character of the crane, who is a sort of similar, perhaps mirror reflection of the wolf archetype, but carries very different connotations in Japanese folklore. So we have, yeah, kind of, I don't know how much more to get into pre-spoiler, but just sort of that idea of we are presented with a lot of very interesting approaches and interpretations to how these characters have shown up in their respective fairy tales, and then uses specifically the entire gamut of Japanese art and culture and entertainment genres to riff on these characters and show a bit of a kaleidoscopic melange of various ways that these figures have been represented and can be represented and might inconceivably yet here conceived as being represented in unique and entertaining ways and heartfelt ways at sometimes too. But there is a lot of comedy, a lot of cartoonish, a lot of slapstick in here. And I think it came together very nicely. How's that for a non-spoiler description?
It's great. I love you said this kaleidoscopic sort of like view, because I kind of mentioned earlier too, the structure of this piece seems like it's in vignettes.
Mm-hmm.
It's like using the same focal points of the wolf or the crane, and roughly the same sort of fairy tale that these characters are predominantly featured in, but displaying it using a different type of Japanese theater or a different type of genre, like you were saying. Like, is it dance? Is it slapstick? Is it just a couple actors folding origami on the stage? Like there was just, again, kaleidoscopic, like so many snapshots of art forms around the Western sphere and Eastern sphere, like kind of all packed together. Yeah. Like, so yes, I think that's a perfect sort of one thing I will mention before we go into a little bit in-depth spoiler zone is we were there opening night, and the first front row, there was a lot of kiddies, a lot of kids, a lot of children. And again, we mentioned the run in Toronto has ended now, but I would love to see this piece, even like who are like to younger audiences or schools, because I think they're on the surface level, like there is obviously like the fairy tale, the cartoonish, the humor. There's enough levity for children, absolutely. But as you were saying, Ryan, too, there's that heartfelt baked into it too. Like definitely for the adults in the audience, like, and especially theater practitioners, which there were a lot of in the opening night audience as well. We have either been trained or we've been privy to Eastern and Western types of theater, and also the potential to like differences and politics that can kind of clash with that. And I think like as you watch this piece too, there is a depth and a sort of give and take of East meets West in this too.
Yeah, this definitely feels
That's
like
kind of what I got from that.
No,
It was
I
like
would
inner
agree.
child fulfilling, but also like there was the sort of opposing like Western Eastern canon and genres, not necessarily like in contrast to each other, but like through the performers, like either like influencing or showing how they've like taught each other one thing or the other. If
Yeah,
that makes sense.
this definitely feels like a very amicable, even-sided process between the two cultures and the two nationalities that brought it about. There's a lot, I guess, just discourse in the scholarship on intercultural theater of, when one of the two sides is a colonial or former colonial power, is there a power imbalance or a bit of an extractionist rhetoric in how one is handling the other? I certainly don't think anything of the sort seems like it's the case here. We had 4 performers. It seemed as though 3 of them were from Japan themselves, and one of them presumably is Canadian. I don't know. I didn't read their bios in full. To the extent this production premiered in Japan, is that correct?
Yes,
we have this very handy bio that I did skim through before we started, but I have not read it.
Yeah, the premiere was October 2023 at the Toyooka Theater Festival in Toyooka, Japan.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah. And then our performers, just
yes,
before we get into, spoiler zone in-depth unpacking. So we had, again, apologies if I'm mispronouncing your names, Sakura Corinne, who's a performer, Kohi Nakadaki, who's a performer, Takako Sagawa, performer, Caitlin Torrance, performer. So those were our 4 performers. And then David Danzin, who is the artistic director of this, was also the concept and the direction was under David's helm there.
Yeah, and all four of the performers were just so excellent in this. They all have such great comedy chops, but they're also clearly very skilled dancers or physical performers. That they just not a weak link in the batch. They're all excellent.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, do you want to get into spoiler zone?
Yeah, we might as well.
We've dropped a lot of pebbles, and I want to.
Yeah, this is a tough show.
Ripple.
Tough show to differentiate what is or is not a spoiler, especially since this stint has ended. But let's just not hold back anything and get into it.
Great. So we're going to pop a paper crane onto the screen for our YouTube viewers. Great. So we're in the spoiler zone.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons I kind of already mentioned, there is a continuous sort of presentation of origami sort of interwoven throughout the performance where either like all of the performers are attempting to make a paper crane. There's an instance where one of the performers wants to make a paper wolf. And so this like visual art sort of acted as a catalyst to take us into like a next vignette throughout
it's
the
a
show. So
good recurring visual motif.
Yes.
They often, once they created their cranes, they would like put it in their hair, and then that would signify that, oh, now the character is a crane. Same with that one instance of the wolf, although a big variety of costume items were used. Who did the costume design? I think they deserve a special shout out.
This designs team too is absolutely fantastic.
Atsuku Kiyokawa did the costume design. So excellent work. Everything, man, so colorful, cartoonish, but like blending of Western animation and anime aesthetics. I think a lot here. So like, just everything popped and was so striking. All of the wolf tails that we saw that constantly hanging behind her. Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, and even just like the neutral blacks that all the performers were donning was like this textured sort of velvet, so it did look like an animal hide as like the base level. But then also when Caitlin, who predominantly like played the crane herself, that sort of like we've been looking at the base blacks of this like sort of wolf velour kind of thing, and then when she was the crane, again that glistening of the velour sort of took on this more elegant. So again, it's just like theater blacks, but like elevated by them being velour. It just added texture. This whole piece to me had like the next level of texture in so many ways. Actually, let's unpack that. Can we unpack that?
Yes, please.
Here we go. Like that's again, this, because it's very, again, East meets West, genres of theater from both realms mashed together. I talk about this a lot in our episodes too, like the use of the mechanisms of theater were very well done in this piece too. There was a whole transition moment where just the stage was engulfed by theater fog and sort of really transition us into the crane aspect of the crane fairy tale, opening up the crane fairy tale. And it was just a moment of the theater space being filled with fog and then here we are.
While the flats were also kind of moving, no physical human or animal form on stage, just the literal background of the theater is moving around, while what looks like the tops of clouds that you could only see from an airplane is what the floor becomes. It was such a visually striking moment. For sure.
And then even light, the use of light, like we start and a spotlight acts as the moon, and then it's a very lovely bookend at the end of the piece where that is the moon again. And again, we talked about by the end, it's very much like East and West sort of in overlapping each other quite literally, like all the performers like overlap their hands, they're doing like a circular motion, and then they sort of morph and combine into wolf and crane and wolf and crane. And then there's this again, we bring back the spotlight, it's the moon with their crane origami hats on, but it also looks like simultaneously wolf ears at the same time. So again, the lighting of when Little Red was on, like the whole theater space was filled in red. When we were in this making origami squares in a lit square gobo, like it was very much the mechanisms of theater were aiding and guiding each representation of theater as we were
just want to give a shout out to Jan Becker, is the set and lighting designer. So everything we're talking about right now, I think, is a big shout out to him. Great work.
Yes. Absolutely. And then while we're there too, like let's shout out Annika Johnson, composer and sound designer. Again,
Mhm.
each vignette is engulfed with sound, whether it be
Mhm.
like a traditional Japanese soundtrack
Or the
in
Looney
a more
Tunes theme song.
exactly the Looney Tunes theme song, like everything was super tailored auditorially to whichever vignette we were in. And again, it's like lighting, sound, effects. These are all things that sort of accessorize the story, but
Mhm.
especially in a piece where the lights are literally going down and when they come back up, we're in a different genre. Same
Mhm.
maybe story, but we're in a different genre. It's imperative for all of those elements to kind of guide that. I think
Mhm.
overall the design team hit the nail on the head with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, for sure. Something you talked
Yeah.
about a moment ago that I think is a structural observation with the piece, not a critique necessarily, but I'm curious what you think about it. Because you mentioned how at the end we get the merging of the crane and the wolf, and that sort of the East meets West. I did feel that, and again, I don't know how I feel about this. If I certainly wouldn't call it a problem, just an observation, that the whole more than the first half of the show was all about the wolf, and then it became about the crane, and the crane not only had a disproportionately smaller portion of the show itself, but I wonder, I'm not saying it would have been better necessarily, but what would the show have been like if it was like we get a wolf vignette and then we get a crane vignette and kind of a more layered stacking of the two, as opposed to you've seen the character from Western folklore. Now we're going to focus for a little bit on a character from Japanese folklore. I don't know. Do you have thoughts about that kind of
Yeah.
interspersing potential?
I agree with you as well. I was a little bit because right once we finally transitioned to the crane fairy tale, I too was like, right, I know this is only 60 minutes, no intermission, and we're well into the piece, like it's past the halfway mark.
Mhm.
What is it almost felt like to me is like, oh, maybe there is a specific reason as to why the crane fairy tale is so much smaller.
Mhm.
But then it ended up through like the depth and the extraordinary like performance and um especially like the solo dance piece that Caitlin does as the crane, like it kind of made up for lack of time. Like I just felt like the whole audience was
Mhm.
kind of time didn't exist. We can get into
Well,
that imagery as
yeah.
well. Like, but I will say, and this is maybe just my take on it, I really enjoyed because in my theater training, obviously, like I had a whole section learning about like Japanese no theater, and it was very interesting. And obviously, nothing I had learned in high school,
Mhm.
and so I was intrigued, and I like really enjoyed all of the sort of resources and like clips of actually watching like performance no theater performances, right? So my thing was so the fact that like the Little Red Riding Hood is which we mentioned that the wolf was predominantly presented through that fairy tale.
Mhm.
So the wolf representing more of like the Western fairy tale world. I did kind of like that, like something that would like most of a Canadian audience would be familiar with is displayed through Japanese art forms. So the
Yes,
bulk of what
100%.
I was seeing was like a story I was maybe familiar with. So that maybe there was a familiarity there, but then it was presented to me through a different a piece of art form that I wouldn't necessarily be as familiar with.
Mhm.
So the fact that took up most of the time, and then we got into the crane like fairy tale and symbolism. I don't know if it's not necessarily saying like maybe that's a reason why the structure was it what was the way it was, but
Mhm.
it to me, I liked that we really took the time to use the same story. And it didn't even really have to be Little Red Riding. It's just obviously that was what this team decided to use. But like use the same story, but showcase it using these art forms that we as Western theater practitioners are maybe not as familiar with,
Mhm.
or even like obviously Western audience along like generally, not just theater practitioners. But yeah, that didn't really answer the structure
No,
thing,
no,
but
it's
it's just
a
a
I
comment on
I think it
yeah.
does kind of answer my thought on it, and I obviously, yes, it makes perfect sense that yes, we're presented with a lot of the show being the Little Red Riding Hood, the fairy tale that surely we grew up hearing many, many times, and we experience it many, many times in this piece,
Mhm.
each through a different style of Japanese traditional art or popular culture. And then it's interesting because we have our sort of maybe slightly longer segment about the Japanese crane wife myth, but then we'd never get like a repetition of it, and we don't get that same sort of repeating cycle. And maybe that's why, to me, it felt perhaps a little lopsided in that way.
But now that we're kind of unpacking,
These,
and if we think of like East West, we think of these opposites, we think of tragedy and comedy. I kind of like that, like we said, there's a lot of levity in this piece, but then there are some heartfelt moments. I liked that a lot of we got the catharsis of laughter and our brains segueing between, slapstick, cartoon, this and that. And but also showcasing, okay, and now like these are art forms you're maybe not familiar with. When we did get hit with the crane story and the exhaustion of the wife and the undulated dance movements and the cornering of the crane, again, when we segued to tragedy,
Mhm.
I did feel as like the story itself necessarily wasn't, devastating or like the most tragic. I did feel like what we had seen for maybe 40 minutes of the performance in this like light laughy, I was primed to be pendulum swung the other way.
Mhm.
And I wonder if like Caitlin's solo dance as the crane or the motions she was using to show the sort of downtrodden exhaustion of the crane, if I would have been as emotionally impacted if I hadn't rinsed out my sort of like giggles and, like my brain
Mhm.
wasn't jiggled before that moment,
Right.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's just
I,
like a take. That's
no, like it works. It's as good as any. It's also interesting how earlier you mentioned how kind of, I forget the exact phrasing you used, something about like time ceases to exist, or correct me
yeah.
if I'm misquoting you.
Yeah.
Whereas, and you also mentioned how like you had the sense that we were well past the halfway point when we did get the transition into Crane Town, I guess. And I like that imagery of the time doesn't exist, or it's sort of time feels dilated in a certain way here, because I didn't, once we did make the transition to the crane, even though it felt like we had been watching it for a little while, I didn't necessarily think that, oh, we're definitely past the halfway point, so let's see where this is going. I thought, oh, maybe this is the halfway point, and our experience of time does feel fluxus in this space. And then I also kind of felt like, while that last image certainly was a powerful one to send us home on, to me, it did also kind of feel like an abrupt ending, partly because I think my mind was expecting to get more of that crane to kind of make it feel more symmetrical in that way. Again, not a critique, it's just a kind of, yeah, I'll keep thinking about this. I don't know.
Yeah, well, and I think because it is again these two companies merging together, and quite honestly, like in the statement saying like, and in the program, it is a presentation of these various art forms using fairy tale land as a sort of story avenue. A lot of this piece too can just be like observing art, because
Mhm.
even like the way in which the dialogue of the Little Red Riding Hood story, or the way in which the grandma moves, or the way in which, the host of the talk show like says that like nothing was like prescribed or like familiar, like it was very
Mhm.
much like art, like
Yeah,
that
for
sounds
sure.
so,
No,
I
I
don't I
know
don't know if that
exactly.
makes sense, but yeah, it's
Yeah, I
it's
get exactly what you mean by that. Yeah.
like chunks of art
Mhm.
using story, using theater mechanism, but at the end of the day, like you're just observing
Mhm.
art.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then again, with all of these performers being extravagant dancers, the movement and the attention to detail when they did the whole like, puppet sequence, and two of our performers were playing puppets operated by the other performers,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? Or the whole cartoon segment where they quite literally were playing like 2D Looney Tune esque cartoon character, like the specificity of physical language in this show, and especially because there's Japanese, English is spoken, and then there's also French subtitles that alongside English subtitles. So there is a lot of auditorial language in this piece, but then it's the physical language that is
Yeah.
so precise.
Mhm.
And again, both these companies obviously being movement companies, that makes sense. But as the genre switched, the sort of the physical prowess was paramount.
Yes,
Yeah.
no, agreed. On the subject of the spoken languages, this is a thought I
Yes.
already kind of shared with you as we were coming back from the theater after. But I will confess that because we had sort of two separate TV screens or monitors, one with the English surtitles and one with the French, and our seat just happened to be much closer to the French one than the English. It took me embarrassingly long to realize that there was English ones on another screen. And like I'm not terribly great at French, but I read it well enough that I was managing just fine with the French one. But for a while, I was like, "Oh, that's an interesting creative choice that it's only in French the surtitles, when even though they're speaking Japanese." And then like, "Oh no, it was there the whole time."
Right.
did you have a similar experience, or
Yeah,
did
it did
you?
take me a second as well. I noticed the French one and I was following along because I too, yeah, can read it decently. But then, yes, I segued over to the other side, stage left, and it was like, oh, there's the English
Mhm.
as well as the French. And I think it's just, the way the theater center had decided to project those captions were via two like
Mhm.
flat screen small TVs, staged left and right. And then you just chose one language per
Yeah.
side. I did like though that the companies decided to, or I guess this would be David being the, concept and director of the piece, decided to put the captions off to the side and not necessarily on the back, like on like a psych or like the back of the theater, because like I said, I think it's the form and the physicality of presenting each sort of iteration of the story was more important than the text itself. I won't necessarily say than the dialogue itself, but
Mhm.
I just feel like if we had the dialogue on the back of the screen, to me, it would have sort of been like another character on stage.
Mhm.
And I don't think that was needed for this piece.
I
Yeah, do you have a thought on that?
My thought is that I agree with the essence of your point, which is why I disagree with the brass tacks of it. And let me
Okay,
elaborate,
unpack.
because I agree that the visuals of the piece is clearly the focus and should be the focus. I think I would have preferred having the surtitles projected onto the psych in closer proximity to that, so I wasn't constantly craning my neck
Oh,
to
true.
look over at something that's a little too far from it. And that, granted, where we were sitting, we were much closer to the French screen, so you did sort of have to keep turning your focus further to the opposite corner to see the English screen. But
Okay.
I think just like the size and location of the surtitles, regardless of which one you're looking at, kind of forces you to take your attention away, because you also, maybe if you go back and watch the show a second time, you know that it's not as important, or you know the rough sketch of what they're going to say, so you could just ignore that altogether. But on the first and only viewing, in our case, you don't know if that's going to be important. You don't know what they're going to say. And in a lot of instances, especially like the talk show sequence, for example, that is important context that you do want to have filling. So you do have to keep averting your gaze from the potent visuals to get the kind of hidden off in the corner text. If it was projected
True.
on the site, you could watch them both simultaneously and just every so often look up and down without losing the very well done bodily imagery.
Yeah, actually, that is true. Now that you've
Okay. I
hashed
wasn't
that
trying
out.
to dissuade you if you enjoyed it
No,
the way
no,
it
no.
was, but
No,
yeah.
because I did enjoy the way it was, but you're right. Like I just I didn't even realize that I did have to kind of steal away, crane
Mhm.
my neck, as you
Okay.
said, to capture the dialogue every once in a while. And I guess yeah, it didn't necessarily deter my
No,
experience,
mine
but
either,
you're right.
but it,
And I
yeah.
think it's just maybe a remedy would be like having it a bit more central, but not
Mhm.
like engulfing the psych.
Oh, yes, I
I feel like
agree.
anytime I see something where like the psych is consumed by something, whether it be text or like an image or what have you, it's now a character on that stage. There's
Mhm.
a reason why we're like, don't touch the psych.
Yeah.
Those are very expensive things, but yeah, like maybe midway or a little bit more center stage with those monitors, so that yeah, we are just looking
Yeah.
up as opposed to off the side.
Come to think of it, I didn't necessarily take note of this. When the characters were speaking English, which did happen periodically throughout the performance, what were the surtitles doing? Because oddly enough, I didn't think to look at them, and it makes sense that I didn't think to, but like they weren't playing Japanese surtitles annotating the English text, were they?
I don't I don't think so, but
Yeah.
again, I don't.
I guess I
really. And again, maybe that was subconsciously me not wanting to look. So if I didn't have
yeah.
to, I didn't.
Yes, if I
I
can
think the
understand what they're
French was
saying.
still going though, because
Makes
visually
sense,
I
yeah.
can remember seeing like out of the periphery, like a
Right.
white text and
Because
the
we were
French
close to the French
text to
one.
our left.
And why
But
this is
yeah,
in my thought, I recently saw Salesman in China at Stratford, and every time a character was speaking English, we had our Mandarin subtitles, and every time a
yeah,
character was speaking Mandarin, we had our English subtitles. So it wasn't prioritizing either language of this is the one you understand, this is the one you hear, this is the one you
right.
read. It was if you hear one, you can read the other. So everybody in every language was on level footing. I don't feel like
I
there, to my view, there were Japanese surtitles provided at any of the English moments in this.
I don't think so either, but please, anyone who's listening to
Yeah,
this or watching, if there was, and just Ryan and I
yeah.
did not happen to capture it,
Like I
please
said, it
let us
took me
know.
so long to even notice that there were English surtitles. I wouldn't put it past myself to miss if there were Japanese surtitles at some point.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. What was your sort of like, did you have like a favorite vignette that stuck out to you?
You asked me this earlier, and I there's so much that I liked in it that it's so hard to kind of. I think just in fealty to my childhood self, I'm a real sucker for the Looney Tunes.
Okay.
So the one that is very like Looney Tunes animation inspired, I think that was really fun. The I do really love the talk show sequence. I think that was just like very fun, very like Maury Povich, Jerry Springer, like classy iteration on trash, which
Yeah.
was like a kind of like Jerry Springer the opera kind of or something like this. That, but yeah, like I think that was really well done, and that I think probably more than any scene had like a very pronounced anime aesthetic, which was kind of very well integrated and played there. Sorry, you asked me, do I have
Yeah.
one favorite? I'm just naming a bunch of them. Did you have one favorite?
Yeah, I loved the I believe I'm pronouncing this correctly, but correct me if I'm wrong. Bunraku is the type of
Yeah.
puppet theater.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm not
Um
certain if that's the correct pronunciation. That's how I've heard it pronounced, but I don't know if it's
yeah,
yeah.
but where Little Red and the Wolf
Mhm.
were like human puppets and then
Yes.
operated by two of the other performers. Again, I just thought the physical specificity and the teamwork, like the duos were just so in sync.
Agreed.
I mean, this whole team was very like the chemistry was so rich and so in sync, but especially in that where you don't think like yes, as a performer, you might be a puppeteer, but you don't think that you're ever going to have to perform as a puppet. So like that was
Mhm.
just already like piqued my interest. And then again, the specificity and the gesturing and again, I just being a practitioner myself, like the
And a puppeteer.
cohesion, and
Mhm.
puppeteer, yes. So like the cohesion and breath work and like yeah, physical relationship that you'd have with your partner and then also with the partners as scene partners, if
Mhm.
that makes any sense. It would have been like quite an elaborate process to blossom or to make that occur. So again, I was enthralled by
Yeah.
that vignette. But
Was,
they all were
oh
like
yeah,
so
yeah. It's a hard to pick one. Was that the one where the woodsman was a samurai, or am I mixing it up with a different one?
um yes, I think at the
Yeah.
end the woodsman was the samurai. Yes,
Yeah.
because it was the same puppet wolf
Yes.
that gets slain by the samurai. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I just like, and I think in terms of the blending the Western fairy tale with the
Yes.
Japanese culture and aesthetics, like, and I think that was the first appearance of the woodsman we see, if I'm remembering the chronology correctly. That where we do see other more traditional hunter woodsman kind of
Yeah.
Western imagery after, but like the fact that we're introduced to that figure as this is very much a Japanese take on this story, that it's a different type of stock figure. Like I thought that was just it was a good way of just very simply demonstrating that while everything else is also demonstrating it just in terms of the cultural aesthetics that are being used to tell the story in this way. But yeah, just
Yeah.
across the board, all the vignettes are so fun, so well done. A lot of this is a word I don't think we've used yet, but panto energy, I think, is a good way of
Yes.
putting it in. I know you performed in a lot of pantos, and I wonder if I would be thinking the same if it wasn't fairy tales being used as the basis for it, but because fairy tales are so often used in pantos. But this constant repetition and riffing and showing through use of pop culture that like there are different ways of telling these stories that you've heard a million times, keeping them fresh, and the also the use of music, and just I think they're pantomime traditions feel like a bit of a perhaps the Western contribution to the storytelling, even if it's then using that to show more innately authentic Japanese styles.
Yeah. Yeah, again, there was constant layering, texture, blending. If there was a contrast, it was, yeah, there was a purpose to that contrast. And then you get like a comparative or like a colliding
Mhm.
mesh of the cultures down the line from that. Yeah. Like I said, there's a lot on the surface that is like, was lovely, a lot of levity, et cetera, et cetera. But then as you unpack and go deeper, it's a kaleidoscope, like we
Yeah,
said. Yeah.
yeah.
And I
Any
do hope it continues
yes.
like touring. I think again, this piece, the timing, like the fact that it is only 60 minutes and the fact that there were children in the audience and they were having a hoot of a time. I just think, yeah, this piece is for anyone and everyone. And
Mhm.
like especially I think it can have a life touring across Canada and around the world to, yeah, I would plug it as like a family
Yeah.
show
Oh, yeah.
for
No.
sure.
But I want to emphasize that it's not like just a kids show. Not that we need
No.
to be derisive towards things that are targeted towards youth audiences, but this is very much. It is a show that is does not actively exclude children from its audience and provides things that they can enjoy and appreciate. But this is 100% the textbook definition of an all ages show.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Okay, I think that's where we
Yeah.
can leave Mukashi
Fantastic.
Mukashi Once Upon a Time. Again, this was a co-production with Corpus Dance Project and Kio, and it ran at the Theater Center from September 25 to 29, 2024. Again, we hope we see it continue gracing stages around the world. On that note, Ryan, let's do our final of the episode plugs.
Mhm.
So, if you are listening or watching, Cup of Hemlock Theatre is who we are. Follow us on YouTube, anywhere you listen to your podcast. We are on Instagram, Facebook, Cup of Hemlock Theatre. Ryan, I'm taking your job.
Yeah. What am I going to
Um,
say in 5 seconds?
Pop in the comments down below as well. We'd love to hear from you. And it is the fall, which means, especially up here in Toronto, up here, just here in Toronto,
The Southern
theater
Ontario up here.
theater companies are rolling out their seasons again. We are coming off of the sunshiny summer hiatus, and we are in full swing of seeing fresh theater grace our stages. So we are super excited to have a ton of duet reviews down the line. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for more there.
Mhm.
Ryan, is there any other plugs that you want to do?
No need to
Took the
find and
words right out of your mouth.
yeah, no need to find and follow me personally, but if you like me and my theater thoughts, most of them tend to live here on Cup of Hemlock. And if you want to know where to find that, just rewind this video and listen to Jill's whole spiel about that. Yeah, that's me. How about you, Jill? Where can
Nice.
people find and follow you?
Yeah, people want to find and follow me. I'm Jillian.robinson96 on Instagram. That's my artist Instagram account. I've been posting a lot of photo shoot vibes, trying to get into some modeling potentially alongside of acting. So that's super great. And Tommy Rhodes, the musical I was a part of in the spring, we are going to be laying down an original soundtrack for that this fall. So super excited to jump back into the Louisiana swamp that was Tommy Rhodes. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for info on that page if you would like. But on that note, let's take our water goblets, do a final cheers. And like I said, you'll be seeing a lot more of us down the line. So stay hydrated, stay well, see live theater, and